Some stories are not remembered because they were loud. They are remembered because somebody stood still when the whole town expected him to turn away. Out on the old Oregon Trail, where dust could get into a man's Bible and grief could sleep beside a woman like a second body, $1 was sometimes more than money. It could be an insult. It could be a door. And once, in the summer of 1883, $1 silver became the first nail in a home no sorrow could tear down. Isabel Carver was being led across the muddy yard behind the county poorhouse when the bell over the courthouse door struck 9. Rain had fallen all night, and the ground of Mercy Bend had turned to brown paste beneath wagon wheels and boots. Her black morning skirt dragged in it. Her right hand clutched a small blue teacup wrapped in a faded shawl, the cup rattling faintly against the bone of her wrist. It had belonged to her husband, and every morning for 2 years she had set it at an empty place on the table before remembering no mouth would touch it again. Now the town meant to sell her labor for a year. Barren widow, called Mr. Enoch Pike, the county clerk, standing on a crate beside the stock rail. Able-bodied enough, no children, no kin willing to claim her, debts attached to the late Carver homestead. A laugh moved through the men near the fence, not loud, but ugly enough to bruise. Isabel kept walking. Her boots were too thin for the mud. Her bonnet had lost one ribbon. Beneath it, her face was pale and proud in the way of a person who has been stripped of nearly everything and refuses to let strangers take the last clean thing inside her. Beside the corral, hens scattered under a wagon. A horse stamped and tossed its head. The smell of wet leather, manure, chimney smoke, and boiled coffee blew through the yard. "Who'll bid?" Pike asked. "1 year's keep and labor. Buyer assumes board, clothing if necessary, and claim against her wages." No one answered. A woman near the store porch whispered, "Wouldn't have her in my kitchen." Bad luck follows a woman who can't give a man a child. Isabel's fingers tightened on the shawl until the teacup bit into her palm. "Come now," Pike said. "She can scrub, sew, milk, I expect." She was married to Henry Carver, though that poor fellow got little enough from the bargain. More laughter. Then a shadow crossed the mud. Thomas Turner stepped from beside his freight wagon, and the yard quieted as if the bell had struck again. He was the largest man in the county, taller than most doorframes, and broad enough that a child could hide behind one of his shoulders. Folks called him Giant Turner when they thought he could not hear, though everyone knew he could. His hat was reindeer, his beard close cut, his coat patched at the elbows. He moved slow, not from weakness, but from the care of a man who knew his own size frightened people. He came to the crate, reached into his vest, and held up $1 silver. "I'll pay the county fee," he said. Pike blinked. "For the widow, for Mrs. Carver's debt hearing," Thomas said, "and for her passage out of this yard. Passage. It's a labor sale." Thomas looked at him. "Not anymore." The clerk's mouth thinned. $1 is the minimum bid. Then take it. Before we go farther, tell me where you are listening from tonight. If this old frontier story touches your heart, give it a like. Share it with someone who loves quiet romance, and subscribe for more tales from the lonely places where love still finds a way. The clerk looked from the dollar to Thomas Turner's face. Men shifted. Women drew shawls tighter. A few boys climbed the fence rail, eager to see whether the giant would be mocked or make trouble. Pike held out his hand. Payment accepted. Thomas set the coin in his palm, but did not let go at once. "You'll write that Mrs. Carver is under no bond to me." "That's not how you'll write it." The rain tapped on hat brims. Thomas's voice had not risen. That made it worse somehow. Pike swallowed and glanced at the sheriff, who leaned beneath the awning, one tome hooked in his belt, and no desire at all to wrestle Thomas Turner in the mud. "Fine," Pike muttered. "Fee paid. Debt postponed pending review. Few canceled," Thomas said. Pike laughed once. "You got $500 for a dead man's failed note?" "No." Thomas looked toward Isabel then, and for the first time, since she had left the poorhouse door. Someone looked at her face instead of her usefulness. But I've got 40 acres of standing timber and a team that can haul it. Right, cancel. Isabel felt the blood drain from her fingers. She had not asked him. She had not asked anyone. Need was one thing. Being bought in front of a town was another. Whether he meant kindness or not, the dollar lay between them like a brand. Pike scratched the note with bad grace. You'll regret it, Turner. A woman with no children and bad debts is a dry well. Thomas took the paper, folded it, and tucked it inside his coat. Then he turned to Isabel. Mrs. Carver, he said, careful as if approaching a skittish mare. Me wagon's headed north. You can ride as far as you please, or not, your choosing. Isabel lifted her chin. Rain ran from the edge of her bonnet. And what do you expect in return? His eyes were gray, tired, and steady. Nothing in this yard. The answer unsettled her more than any insult could have done. She looked toward the street. No one stepped forward. Mrs. Voss from the Mercantile pretended to examine a bolt of cloth through the window. The banker, Silas Rudd, smiled as though watching a poor bargain improve his morning. Even Reverend Bell held his hat in both hands and said nothing. Isabel walked to Thomas Turner's wagon, because standing there any longer would have been another kind of death. The wagon was loaded with flour sacks, fence wire, nails, coffee tins, a cracked stove door, and a bundle of saplings tied in burlap. 2 massive bay horses waited in the traces, steam rising from their backs. Thomas helped her up without touching more than the edge of her sleeve, and even that he released quickly. She settled among the sacks with the shawl and teacup in her lap. As they rolled out of Mercy Bend, one boy called, Giant bought himself a Barren wife for $1. The words struck the wagon boards and stayed there. Thomas pulled the team to a halt. Isabel closed her eyes. She could bear many things, but not another spectacle. Thomas turned on the seat. He did not climb down. He did not shout. He simply looked at the boy's father, a narrow man with a pipe clenched between his teeth. You teach him better, Thomas said. The father stared at the mud. Thomas clicked to the team, and the wagon moved on. For 3 miles neither of them spoke. The road north curved through wet sage and scattered pine, climbing toward the rough shoulder of the Blue Mountains. Ruts brimmed with water. The wagon wheels sucked and groaned. Isabel sat with her back straight until every muscle shook. She had slept poorly on a straw tick in the county house, listening to 2 old women breathe and 1 young girl cry into her apron. Her own house, the Carver place, had been locked by the bank 2 days before. The room where Henry's coat still hung behind the door was sealed with a strip of paper and red wax. Thomas drove as if silence were a familiar road. At noon he stopped near a creek swollen brown with rain. He climbed down and lowered the wagon step. His size made the motion almost awkward, as if the world had been built too small, and he had spent his life apologizing to chairs, doorways, and frightened horses. There's coffee, he said. Bread too. I'm not hungry. He nodded, as if that was neither lie nor truth, just weather. He built a small fire under a dripping cedar and set a blackened pot on stones. Then he cut 2 pieces of yesterday's bread, spread each with beans from a tin, and placed one on the wagon wheel beside her. He took his own to the creek bank and ate standing, his back partly turned so she would not feel watched. Isabel stared at the bread until her stomach hurt worse than pride. She had eaten 1 bowl of thin soup the day before. The county woman had taken her wedding ring as security against extra meals. Isabel had not told anyone it left a pale band on her finger that felt colder than bare skin should. At last she lifted the bread. It was coarse, a little stale, and tasted of smoke from his supplies. She ate every crumb. Thomas did not remark on it. When he brought coffee in a tin cup, she held out the blue teacup instead. Pour it here. He looked at the cup, saw the hairline crack down one side, and poured carefully. Thank you, she said, because manners had survived where comfort had not. He sat on an overturned log several feet away. Rain shook from the cedar boughs. A jay screamed from somewhere uphill. "My place is called North Star Ranch," he said. "It ain't much of a ranch now. Mostly timber, a bad barn, 6 cows, hens when the fox doesn't win, and more fenced down than standing. Why take me there? I didn't say you had to go there. Why pay at all, then?" Thomas turned the tin cup in both hands. "Because I heard them say the word Barren like it. Gave them the right to forget you were a woman." The creek moved between stones. Isabel's throat closed so abruptly she looked away. "That word is true," she said. "No," Thomas answered. "It's only a word folks use when they don't know where to put their cruelty." She glanced at him then. He did not soften the statement with a smile. He looked embarrassed by having said so much. "My husband wanted children," Isabel said. "He wanted sons, a table full of them. He built a cradle before we had a bedstead." Thomas's gaze lowered to the mud. "I'm sorry. I burned the cradle after he died." She had not meant to say that. It came out plain, like a stone dropping in water. She remembered the splintering crackle of it in the yard, the way neighbors had watched from behind curtains, the way the little carved lamb on the cradle's footboard had blackened before the rest. Henry had been kind at first, then disappointed, then quiet in a way that made the house colder than any winter. When fever took him, he died with his face turned to the wall. Thomas said nothing. Somehow that was the only answer she could bear. By evening they reached North Star Ranch. It sat in a shallow valley cupped by pine ridges and pale grass, with a creek bending behind the barn and a stand of cottonwoods shivering near the house. The house was smaller than Isabel expected for a man Thomas's size, built of squared logs and patched plank, with a roof that sagged over the porch like tired shoulders. A woodpile leaned half-fallen under a tarp. Fence rails lay scattered near the corral. Hens scratched beneath a wagon bed. The barn doors hung uneven, one tied with rope. Nothing about it looked welcoming, yet smoke rose from the chimney. Thomas climbed down first and looped the lines around the break. "You can sleep in the front room tonight. There's a latch inside." "Where will you sleep?" "Barn. In this rain, I've slept drier." "Slept wetter too," she almost argued, then stopped. Arguing would imply belonging. She stepped down without his help, though the mud caught her boot and nearly took it. Inside, the house smelled of ash, lamp oil, damp wool, and old coffee. The front room held a rough table, 2 chairs, a stove with one black eye missing, a shelf of mismatched plates, and a Bible lying beneath a flour sack to keep the roof drip from touching it. A second room stood behind a curtain. To the right, a narrow door was closed. Thomas noticed her looking. "That room stays shut," he said. The words were not harsh, but the air around them changed. Isabel nodded. He brought in flour, beans, and a folded blanket. He set a lamp on the table and struck a match. Its light showed the neglect more gently than daylight would have done. Dust lay on the window sill. Dried mud marked the floor. A man's shirt hung over a chair, mended badly with black thread. Near the stove, a kettle waited empty. "You can use anything," he said. "Water pumps out back. Wood's on the porch, though half of it's green. If you'd rather I take you to another town tomorrow, I will. And if I stay tonight—" "Fen, you stay tonight?" She laid Henry's teacup on the table. The little blue cup looked foolish in that rough room, like a memory dressed too fine for work. Thomas looked at it once and looked away. After he stepped outside, Isabel slid the bolt into place. Then she stood in the center of the room and listened to his boots cross the porch, descend the steps, and go toward the barn. The rain thickened. A horse blew softly. Somewhere in the walls, wind found a crack and whistled. She did not cry. She scrubbed the table. It was not gratitude. It was not affection. It was survival. A woman who put her hands to work could keep from falling apart. She pumped water in the dark, carried it inside, and wiped the table until old grease lifted from the grain. She shook out the blanket. She stacked 3 pieces of wood by the stove. She washed his 2 plates, then the kettle, then the blue cup, though it was already clean. At last, past midnight, she sat at the table and set the cup across from her, as she had every morning with Henry. The empty chair looked back. "Foolish," she whispered. She moved the cup to her side of the table. In the barn, Thomas Turner sat awake on a hay bale with his coat collar up and a lantern at his feet. His horse, Samson, slept standing with one hind hoof cocked. Thomas held the folded debt paper in his hand and read Pike's crabbed writing again and again by yellow light. $500 due. Timberlian. Carver property released only on payment. He had lied by omission. He had not canceled Isabel's debt. He had taken it onto himself. A man alone could work until his back split. Thomas had been doing that for years. A man with something to lose worked different. He folded the paper and tucked it into the inside lining of his coat, where it pressed against an older thing he carried there. A small photograph of a woman with 2 solemn little boys, his sister, Anne, and her sons. All gone in one winter diphtheria outbreak, while Thomas had been snowed in 3 valleys away, hauling freight no one remembered. He shut his eyes. In the house, through the rain, he heard the faint scrape of a chair. The next morning, Isabel woke before dawn to a rooster with more courage than sense. For a moment, she did not know the ceiling. Then the sale yard returned, the dollar, the wagon, Thomas Turner's voice saying, "Not any more." She rose from the blanket and dressed quickly. Cold had settled in the room. The stove held ash but no fire. Through the window she saw Thomas chopping wood in the gray morning. His sleeves rolled despite the chill. Each swing of the axe split the damp air. The man looked carved out of the same mountain that rose behind the ranch. Isabel found coffee, flour, salt, and a small crock of lard. By the time Thomas came in with an armload of wood, she had biscuits in a pan, coffee boiling, and the stove drawing properly after clearing old ash from the flue. He stopped just inside the door. She did not turn. "Your stove smokes because the pipe is half choked. I know. Knowing and fixing are cousins, not twins." A sound came from him that might have been a laugh, if it had ever learned how. He stacked the wood. "Yes, ma'am." They ate at the table. Isabel put one biscuit on his plate, then another when she saw how carefully he broke the first, as though making it last. He ate with a restraint that did not fool her. A man his size needed more food than this ranch had been giving him. "You keep hens?" she asked. "Some. Eggs, when they're feeling generous. Garden." He shook his head. "Ground's stubborn. Ground usually is." Again, the almost laugh. After breakfast, he carried his plate to the basin. She took it from him. "I can wash it," he said. "So can I." They stood a moment with the plate between them, both surprised by the smallness of the quarrel. At last he let go. That first week, they lived like 2 strangers, sharing a storm cellar. Thomas slept in the barn and came in only for meals or supplies. Isabel cleaned because dirt offended her grief. She swept mouse droppings from corners, boiled rags, scrubbed the stove, patched the curtain, and set coffee on the back of the stove before dawn. She mended his shirts with thread that matched. She repaired the torn flour sack and turned it into a towel. She found 3 eggs beneath the hay manger and informed the hens they would do better. Thomas fixed the pump handle because she asked once and then said no more. He set a dry box beside the back door for her wood kindling. He brought down a pail from a shelf too high for her and placed it lower without mention. He built a step from scrap boards after seeing her struggle to reach the close line. Neither tanked the other too often. Tanks made the arrangement feel tender. Tenderness was dangerous. The closed room remained closed. On the 7th evening, Isabel found a child's marble beneath the pantry shelf. It rolled into her palm, blue glass with a twist of white inside. She stood very still. Thomas came in, carrying a coil of rope, and stopped when he saw it. "I was sweeping," she said. His face changed so quickly she wished she had left the marble in the dust. "My sister's boy," he said. "Caleb. He lost that everywhere?" She held it out. Thomas did not take it at first. Then he reached, and the marble looked impossibly small in his broad palm. "Was he yours to raise?" Isabel asked softly. "He would be when." Thomas closed his hand. "Anne wrote that she was bringing the boys west come spring. I built beds in that room, painted a chest blue, bought a primer from a traveling peddler." His jaw moved. "Diphtheria took them in February, all three." Isabel looked toward the closed door. "How long ago?" 5 years. 5 years. And the room still shut. 5 years, and the house still waiting. Set a cup for Henry," she said. "Every morning for near 2 years." Thomas looked at her then. She had not planned to offer him anything that true. "Does it help?" he asked. "No." She folded her hands in her apron, but not setting it felt like burying him twice. Thomas nodded once, slowly. "I understand that." The next day, Isabel did not touch the closed room, but she dusted the hallway outside it. By late June, the valley dried into gold. North Star Ranch began to change in little ways a passerby might not notice, but Thomas did. The woodpile stood squared beneath its tarp. The hens had a repaired coop and laid more eggs, as if Shame worked on chickens too. Beans soaked every third night. Bread rose beneath a cloth on the shelf. Coffee stayed warm longer. A line of laundry snapped clean in the wind. Near the back step, Isabel turned a patch of stubborn ground with a spade and planted onions, beans, and late corn saved from seed she found in a jar. Thomas watched from the corral while pretending to mend a bridle. "You'll break your back on that ground," he said. "Not if I break it first. It's full of stone. Then it is full of something useful." The next morning he left a pile of stones near the patch, sorted by size. By evening she had edged the garden with them. When the first green shoots came up, Isabel stood over them a long time with one hand pressed to her mouth. Thomas saw from the barn and did not interrupt. In town, Mercy Ben did not let a thing go easily. On a Saturday in July, Thomas drove Isabel in for supplies. She wore her black dress, washed and brushed, and a brown shawl he had brought from a peddler without presenting it as a gift. He had simply left it folded by the door and said, "That one's warmer," she had said. "I'll pay you back." He had nodded, though they both knew she had no coin. At Voss Mercantile, conversation thinned when they entered. Mrs. Voss stood behind the counter, sharp-eyed and powdered with flour. "Mr. Turner," she said, "need your usual." "And calico," Thomas said. "Thread, sugar, if the price ain't robbery." Mrs. Voss's gaze slid to Isabel. "Calico, my, setting up house proper, are we?" Isabel lifted a bolt of plain blue fabric. "How much, for you?" Mrs. Voss tapped her chin. "Cash only." Thomas put his hand into his pocket. Isabel touched his wrist before he could pull money out. The store seemed to hold its breath. "I have eggs," Isabel said. Mrs. Voss laughed. "Eggs are not currency. They are when your baker has none, and your husband likes cake on Sunday." The baker's wife, standing near the molasses barrel, turned. "How many eggs?" 2 dozen by Monday, Isabel said. "Clean sound, packed in straw." "For 3 yards of calico and a spool of blue thread." Mrs. Voss's mouth tightened. The baker's wife stepped forward. "I'll take them." Isabel looked back to Mrs. Voss. "Then perhaps you will sell the calico to Mrs. Bell and let her trade with me." A chuckle slipped from the back of the store. Mrs. Voss flushed. Thomas stood silent beside Isabel, but his silence had weight. It was not the silence of a man who would speak for her. It was the silence of a man making room for her voice to stand. Mrs. Voss cut the fabric. Outside, while Thomas loaded flour, Isabel found Silas Rudd waiting near the hitching rail. The banker wore a gray suit too fine for the mud and gloves too pale for honest work. "Mrs. Carver," he said, "I trust Mr. Turner has told you the status of your late husband's debt." her body chilled despite the sun. Thomas came around the wagon. "Rudd," the banker smiled. "Your generosity has bought a delay, not a miracle. Timber prices are poor. Notes come due. A widow's burden can sink a large man." Isabel turned to Thomas. "What does he mean?" Thomas's face closed. Rudd's smile widened. "Oh, not told then. How gallant." "Leave it," Thomas said. "I only believe a woman should know the price paid for her." The words landed like a slap. Isabel climbed into the wagon before either man could see her knees weaken. All the way back to North Star, the blue calico lay beside her like evidence. Thomas drove with his shoulders set. At the creek crossing she spoke. "You took Henry's debt." Thomas did not pretend not to understand. "Yes." "Why?" "Because Pike wouldn't release you otherwise." "You said cancel." "I said to write canceled." He wrote postpone. Rudd bought the note before I could stop him. "How much?" He hesitated. "How much, Thomas?" "500. She looked away toward the creek, where sunlight broke into trembling pieces. "I can repay that." "I didn't ask you to." "That makes it worse." He drew the team to a halt. "Mrs. Carver, do not call me that, as if it fixes what happened." Her voice shook. "I was sold for $1 in front of a town that already thought me useless. And now I learn there is a $500 chain I cannot see." Thomas flinched as if the words had struck him physically. "I never meant it so." Men rarely mean the harm they are too proud to explain. He looked at the lines in his hands. She regretted it immediately, which made her angrier. When they reached the ranch, she carried the calico inside and folded it on the table. Thomas unharnessed the team and did not come in for supper. That night, Isabel packed. She owned very little. The black dress she wore, the brown shawl, the blue teacup, Henry's photograph in a tin frame, a comb with missing teeth, and the calico she had earned with eggs not yet laid. She folded everything into the faded shawl. Her hands moved steadily. Her breathing did not. The moon rose thin over the cottonwoods. She opened the door just before dawn. Thomas sat on the porch steps. He had been there long enough for dew to silver his shoulders. "I won't stop you," he said. "Then why are you sitting there?" "Because the east road washed out in last night's runoff. If you go, take the ridge trail. It's longer but safer." She stared at the back of his head. He held out a small sack without turning. Biscuits, jerky, coffee tied in paper. The bundle in her arms became suddenly heavy. "You make it hard to despise you," she said. "That wasn't my aim." "What was?" He turned then. In the first light, he looked older than he had in town. Not weak, worn. "To see you get a choice." She should have stepped past him. Pride told her to. Fear told her to. The memory of that boy yelling from the fence told her never to accept a kindness that could be mistaken for ownership. But from inside the house came the small, ordinary sound of the kettle settling on the stove, where she had left water for morning coffee out of habit. Thomas heard it too. He looked toward the door, then back at her. "Stay until the beans come in," he said. It was not a grand plea. It was not a promise. It was a simple sentence with dirt under its nails. Isabel closed her eyes. "Only until the beans," he said. He nodded. "Only until the beans." She went back inside. By August, the beans climbed their poles like small green prayers. Work stitched them into a pattern neither named. Thomas sold timber twice a month, taking a wagon down the rough road before sunrise and returning after dark with shoulders bent from loading. Isabel kept accounts on the back of old freight bills, discovering quickly that Thomas had a poor head for numbers and a worse one for charging what his labor was worth. "You underprice yourself," she said one evening, pointing at a column. "I get paid, you get used," he shrugged. She dipped the pen again. "Mr. Danner pays 20 cents more per cord to men who deliver half as clean. Danner don't like me. Danner likes timber. Speak his language." Thomas sat across the table. trying to look patient and failing. The lamp lit the scar across one of his knuckles and the deep line between his brows. "You ever keep books?" he asked. "My father ran a mill before fever took him. I kept tally from 12 years old. So you can read a ledger better than Rod?" "I suspect a mule can read a ledger better than Mr. Rod pretends when widows are involved." Thomas's mouth twitched. The next timber sale brought 20 cents more per cord. Isabel said nothing when he placed the extra coins on the table. Thomas said nothing when she counted them twice and hid 3 in a cracked sugar bowl against winter. The ranch responded to her the way neglected things sometimes respond to steady hands. The garden thickened. The hens grew bold. A repaired gate stopped banging all night. The barn roof received new shakes where rain had been rotting the beam. Curtains appeared in the front room, made from the blue calico after Isabel decided a dress was less necessary than a window that did not look lonely at dusk. One evening, Thomas came in and stopped at the sight of them. "You used your cloth." "I was tired of the room staring out naked." "They're pretty." She smoothed one curtain edge. "They're straight, pretty as for Sunday hats." "They're pretty," he repeated, softly enough that she could pretend not to hear. The closed room still waited. It was Isabel who opened it in September, but not by choice. A storm came early, hard and wild. Wind drove rain sideways, and thunder rolled over the ridge like wagons on planks. One of the barn doors tore loose near midnight. Thomas ran into the yard in his drawers and coat, and Isabel followed with a lantern, shouting over the storm. Together they wrestled the door back with rope, while the horses panicked and the cows bawled. A splinter caught Thomas's forearm, slicing it deep from wrist toward elbow. By the time they stumbled inside, blood darkened his sleeve. "Sit," Isabel ordered. "It's nothing." "It is running onto the floor." He sat. She cut the sleeve away, cleaned the wound with boiled water, and stitched it while he gripped the table edge. He did not curse. He did not pull away. Sweat stood on his forehead. "You've done this before," he said through his teeth. "Henry cut his hand on a scythe once. My mother taught me before that. You miss him?" The needle paused. Outside, rain hammered the roof. "I miss who I was before wanting became a debt." She drew the thread through. "I miss mornings before counting what had not come. I miss being touched without apology. I miss setting bread to rise and believing the future had a chair at the table." She tied the stitch. "I do not know if that is the same as missing him." Thomas breathed slowly. When the bandage was tied, he tried to stand and swayed. Blood loss had left his face gray. "You can't sleep in the barn," she said. "Floor's fine." "You're too large for the floor. That ain't news." She looked toward the closed room. He followed her gaze and stiffened. "Ma," she said gently, "there are beds in there." The storm filled the silence. At last he took the lantern and walked to the narrow door. His injured hand fumbled with the latch. Isabel almost reached to help, but something told her this was a door a person had to open for himself. The room smelled of cedar, dust, and old grief. 2 small beds stood against opposite walls, each covered with a quilt. A blue-painted chest sat beneath the window. On a shelf lay a slate, a primer, a wooden horse with one wheel missing, and a folded red scarf. The air had been untouched so long it seemed to hold its breath. Thomas stepped in and stood like a man at a graveside. Isabel remained in the doorway. "I'll air it tomorrow." "No." His voice was rough. Tonight, he sat on one of the beds. It creaked beneath his weight, and that ordinary sound nearly undid him. He pressed his good hand over his eyes. Isabel crossed the room and opened the window a crack despite the rain. Cold air moved in. The curtain, stiff with dust, stirred. She took the quilt from the other bed and shook it once. A small object fell to the floor. The blue marble rolled to Thomas's boot. He looked at it and laughed once, brokenly. Then he bent forward and wept without sound. Isabel set the quilt over his shoulders. She did not touch his head. She did not tell him grief would pass, because it had not passed through her. It had only changed rooms. In the morning she found him asleep on the child's bed, knees bent because he was far too long for it, the blue marble still in his hand. After that, the doors stayed open, not wide at first, just enough for air. Isabel washed the quilts and hung them in pale sun. Thomas repaired the window latch. The blue chest held winter blankets instead of dust. The shelf remained with its primer and wooden horse, but the room no longer felt like a sealed wound. Sometimes Thomas stood in the doorway with coffee cooling in his hand. Sometimes Isabel passed and saw him smile faintly at the ridiculous smallness of the beds. Mercy Ben noticed changes before admitting them. North Star eggs became known as good eggs. Isabel's butter, when she had cream enough, sold quickly. Her accounts helped Thomas pay interest on the note in October. And Rudd did not like how neatly the coins arrive, wrapped in paper, each amount written in Isabel's hand. "You've made yourself useful," the banker said. Isabel looked at him across his desk. Thomas stood behind her, hat in hand, letting her handle it. "I always was," she answered. Rudd's eyes lifted to Thomas. "Careful, a woman with a sharp pencil can cut a man's purse strings," Thomas said. "Then I'd best not leave my purse where fools can grab it." The clerk snorted before turning it into a cough. Outside, Isabel's smile came and went too fast for most men to see. Thomas saw it and stored it away. That winter came hard. Snow fell before Thanksgiving and stayed. The valley whitened. The creek skinned over with ice at the edges. Thomas cut wood until his hands cracked. Isabel rendered lard, dried apples over the stove, patched socks, banked coals, and laid feed for the hens under cover. Their world shrank to firelight, animal breath, snow glare, and the steady argument of survival. At night, wind pressed against the house like a hungry thing. Sometimes Isabel woke from dreams of the poorhouse and heard Thomas in the other room, moving quietly. He had taken to sleeping on a cot near the stove after his arm healed poorly in the cold. One night, half awake, she heard him say a name, Caleb. It was not loud. It was not for her. The next morning she set the blue marble beside his coffee. He looked at it, then at her. "Found it near the stove," she said. "No, you didn't." "No." He closed his fingers around it. "Thank you." That same day, a rider came through snow with news of an overturned wagon 2 miles south. Thomas hitched the team before the man finished speaking. Isabel packed blankets, coffee, bandages, and bread. They found the wagon half buried near a drift, one wheel broken, a mule dead in the traces. Inside were a woman burning with fever and 3 children huddled under a quilt, a boy of about 8, a girl near 6, and a baby with a cough that rattled like dry beans in a tin. The woman's name was Clara Finch. Her husband had gone ahead to find work and never returned. She had tried to reach relatives in Walla Walla. Fever had taken her strength. Fear had taken the children's voices. Thomas carried Clara to the wagon as if she weighed no more than bundled laundry. Isabel gathered the baby inside her shawl. The older boy tried to lift a sack of clothes and nearly fell. "What's your name?" Isabel asked him. "Eli," he whispered. "Eli, carry that small tin if you can. Leave the rest. Hands before things." He obeyed. At North Star, the closed room became a sick room. The small beds were no longer memories. They held shivering children. Isabel moved through the days with sleeves rolled and hair pinned tight, brewing willow bark tea, changing cloths, coaxing broth between clenched lips, warming bricks at the stove for cold feet. Thomas carried water, split wood, tended animals, and stood helpless when the baby cried until Isabel placed the child against his chest and said, "Walk slow." He walked slow. The baby quieted against the great wall of him. Clara Finch died 2 nights before Christmas. The snow outside was blue under moonlight. Her children slept from exhaustion. Clara's fever-bright eyes found Isabel. "Don't let the county have them," she whispered. Isabel leaned close. "Rest now. promise. The word tore through the room. Isabel thought of the poorhouse yard, Pike's voice, the dollar, the boy laughing. She thought of being weighed as labor and called empty because no child had come from her body. She took Clara's hand. I promise. Clara looked toward Thomas, who stood at the foot of the bed with his hat crushed in both hands. You too, she breathed. Thomas's voice was thick. I promise. By dawn she was gone. They buried Clara on a rise beneath the pines because the road to town was blocked. Thomas carved her name into a board with his pocket knife. Eli stood beside the grave without crying, his jaw clenched in a way no child's jaw should be. Ruth, the little girl, held Isabel's skirt. The baby, whom Clara had called Annie, slept in Thomas's arms, one tiny hand tangled in his beard. After the prayer, Eli looked up. Are we going to the poorhouse? No, Isabel said. Thomas looked at her. She looked back. No, he said. Children change the house faster than curtains. They changed the sound of morning first. Eli woke early and tried to be useful before anyone could send him away. Ruth followed Isabel from stove to pump to henhouse, asking questions in a whisper. Annie cried at odd hours and then smiled with her whole toothless mouth as if the world had never broken a promise. The little beds became theirs. The blue chest held their clothes. The primer came down from the shelf, and Eli stared at it like it might bite. I can't read much, he muttered. Then which is where we'll start, Isabel said. I can work, you can do both. Thomas cut a new rail for the crib he built from scrap lumber and the side of an old feed box. When Isabel saw it, her face went still. He knew why. He remembered the cradle she had burned. I can take it out, he said quickly. She touched the rough sanded edge. No carved lamb, no varnish, just pine, plain and strong. No, she said. Annie needs a place. That night, after the children slept, Isabel stood at the stove washing cups. Thomas came in from checking the animals, snow on his shoulders. Mrs. Carver, he began. Isabel, he stopped. She kept washing, but her cheeks warmed. He removed his hat. Isabel. It sounded careful in his mouth, almost reverent, almost frightening. Thomas, she answered, and handed him a dry towel. They did not speak of it. In January, the county came. Pike arrived with Sheriff Dale and a sleigh bell jingling obscenely bright in the cold. Isabel saw them from the window and set Annie in Ruth's arms. Take her to the back room, she said. Eli stood. I can hide. No, Isabel said. No one in this house hides from men doing wrong. Thomas came in from the barn, snow on his boots, and met Pike at the porch. Morning, Pike said, though his face made it no greeting. We've come regarding the Finch children. They are warm, Thomas said. They are word subject to county placement. They have placement. Pike glanced past him to Isabel. With a widow bought at public fee and a bachelor under debt? That will not satisfy the board. Isabel stepped onto the porch. She wore Clara's baby on her hip now, wrapped in the brown shawl. Ruth clung to her skirt. Eli stood behind Thomas with fists at his sides. The mother placed them with us, Isabel said. No paper. I promise is paper enough when decent people hear it. Pike smirked. Law requires more than sentiment. Sheriff Dale shifted, uncomfortable. He was not a bad man, only one accustomed to letting paperwork do his conscience's labor. Thomas's hands closed slowly. Isabel saw it. She touched his sleeve. Let me, she said. Then she faced the sheriff. Mr. Dale, you were in the yard the day Mr. Turner paid my county fee. He looked down. I was. You heard the names I was called? He did not answer. You heard what the town thought of a woman without children. Pike snapped. This has no bearing. It has every bearing. Isabel's voice stayed level, though her heart hammered, because now her children stand in a warm house, fed and clothed, and the county wants to drag them back through the same mud, not for their good, for order, for a ledger line, for the comfort of men who trust ink more than mercy. Pike's face reddened. You are not their mother. Ruth began to cry. Isabel felt the words hit the old bruise inside her. Not their mother. Not anyone's. Barren. Empty. Bought? Thomas stepped forward, but she lifted one hand. No, she said softly. I did not bear them. She looked down at Ruth and touched the child's hair. But I know when Annie coughs before she wakes. I know Eli hides crusts in his pocket because hunger taught him not to trust supper. I know Ruth will not sleep unless the lamp is left low and the door is open. I know their mother's grave is under our pines. And I know she asked me not to let the county have them. The sheriff swallowed. Pike scoffed. Pretty speech. Thomas came down one step. The porch boards groaned under him. His voice was quiet enough that even the sleigh bells seemed to hush. You take them, he said. You take me first. The sheriff looked at Thomas Turner's size, then at the children, then at Isabel's white face. No one's taking children today, he said. Pike spun. Sheriff? I said not today. Board can be proper. They can come with Judge Halpern if they feel righteous enough. They left with snow cutting around their boots. When the sleigh disappeared, Isabel sat down hard on the porch bench, Annie still in her arms. Thomas crouched in front of her, making himself smaller. You all right? She laughed once, but it trembled. No. Ruth climbed into her lap. Eli leaned against the porch post, trying not to look relieved. Thomas looked at the three children, then at Isabel. Something in his face opened and hurt at the same time. Well, make it legal, he said. How? I don't know yet, but Rod knew. 2 days later, the banker sent a letter. Full payment of the Carver note and associated lien would be required by March 1st. Failure would result in seizure of claim, livestock, timber rights, and dwelling. Isabel read the letter twice. Thomas took it from her and read it once. Can he do that? She asked. He can try. How much remains? $412. She gripped the table. The children were in the other room. Annie babbled from the crib. Ruth sounded out letters with Eli, who pretended not to care and corrected her twice. $412 might as well have been a mountain. Thomas folded the letter. I can sell the north timber stand. You said cutting would leave the ridge open to slide. It might. In heavy spring rain, it will. Then, no. He looked at her. There's no other way. There is always another way until a fool chooses the worst one, because it is fast. His eyes flashed. You think I don't know what that ridge holds? I know every tree on it. I also know what happens if Rod takes this place. Those children go to county hands. You go back under their tongues. And I go back to being a large man in an empty house. The words rang. Isabel's anger softened into something more dangerous. You would ruin the land to save us. I'd ruin myself first. That is not noble, Thomas. That is lonely. He turned away. She followed him to the door. Look at me. He did. She held the letter between them. You do not get to decide alone what happens to a home I have worked for. Children I promised, and a future I am standing inside whether either of us knows what to call it. His throat moved. What do you want me to do? He asked. Listen. It was the smallest command she had ever given him, and the hardest. That night, they spread every account, bill, receipt, and scrap of tally across the table. Isabel calculated butter sales, egg trade, timber price, feed cost, and the value of the spare wagon. Thomas added what he could earn hauling freight if the pass stayed open. Eli crept from bed and stood in the doorway. I can work for Mr. Voss, he said. No, Isabel and Thomas said together. Eli's face burned. Thomas softened his voice. Your work is school, chores here, and being a boy when you can manage it. I ain't little. No, Thomas said. That's why I am asking hard work of you. Eli considered that, then nodded and went back to bed with dignity. By February, North Star became a place of relentless labor. Thomas hauled freight on frozen roads. Isabel took in mending from women who still whispered about her, but liked her straight seams. Eli chopped kindling and learned multiplication by counting eggs. Ruth fed hens with solemn importance. Annie took her first wobbling steps from the table to Thomas's boot and sat down laughing when he looked too astonished to breathe. They saved $200. Then Thomas fell through the barn loft. It happened on a gray afternoon while sleet ticked against the windows. A rotten board gave way under his weight, and he came down hard on the packed dirt, striking his head against a feed trough. Isabel heard the crack from the house. By the time she reached him, he was trying to rise. "Don't you dare," she said. "I'm fine." "You are a terrible liar." He blinked. "Need to finish the loft. You need to remain alive so I don't have to learn how to drag a giant into bed." His mouth moved like he wanted to laugh, but could not find the strength. She and Eli got him into the house by stubbornness, prayer, and the use of a door as a sled. For 3 days he drifted in fever and pain, too heavy to move easily, too restless to leave unwatched. Isabel changed cloths, spooned broth, and sat beside him through nights that smelled of vinegar, smoke, and fear. Once, near dawn, he caught her wrist. "Don't sell the cup," he whispered. She froze. His eyes were barely open. "Don't sell Henry's cup," he said. "I can haul by April." "Don't sell what kept you alive." Her tears came then, silent and angry. She bent her forehead to his hand. "You foolish man," she whispered. "You think of my cup while your skull is split through." "Blue," he murmured. "Like Caleb's marble." She held his hand until he slept. He woke properly on the 4th day to find Ruth asleep in a chair, Eli reading haltingly from the primer, and Isabel standing at the stove with Annie tied to her back in a shawl. Sunlight fell through the blue curtains. The room smelled of bread. Thomas watched them a long time. Then he said, "This house is noisy." Isabel turned. "You?" "Yes." His eyes moved from child to child and came back to her. "Good." Rudd came himself on March 1st. Snowmelt ran from the eaves. Mud had returned to the yard, just as it had been in Mercy Bend the morning of the sale. Thomas could stand, but only with a cane. His head still ached. He wore his best shirt, mended at cuffs and collar. Isabel wore the black dress no longer as mourning, but because it was clean and strong. A wagon followed Rudd. 2 men sat in it, ready to inventory what could be taken. The children stood inside by the window. Rudd stepped around a puddle. "Mr. Turner, Mrs. Carver, I believe you know why I'm here." Isabel held out a cloth purse. $236. Rudd did not take it. "The balance is $412. This is what we have now. We request extension till harvest." "Denied." Thomas's jaw tightened. Rudd glanced toward the house. "Sentiment is expensive, especially when feeding other people's strays." Thomas took 1 step forward, cane sinking in mud. Isabel moved before him. "Do not speak of the children." Rudd smiled. "I speak of collateral, a ranch without clear title, a widow under former debt, a man unable to work, 3 dependents with no legal adoption. It is a weak position." Isabel heard Annie crying inside. Ruth tried to hush her. The sound steadied something in her. "You arranged this," Isabel said. Rudd's smile flickered. "You bought Henry's note not because it was profitable, because you wanted the Carver place, then North Star's timber after Thomas stepped in. You knew public shame would make me leave or make him spend himself poor." Rudd removed his gloves finger by finger. "Accusations require proof. I have your letters to Pike." The yard seemed to still. Thomas turned his head slowly toward her. Rudd's face went pale, then red. "You have no such thing. Mrs. Voss does." That was a lie, but not an empty one. Isabel has spent weeks watching, listening, collecting crumbs of carelessness. Mrs. Voss had let slip that Pike drank at the back of the mercantile and left papers in his coat. The clerk had bragged of Rudd's plan, where ears sharper than his morals could hear. Isabel had written each date, each phrase, each witness in her ledger. The sheriff rode in then with Judge Halpern beside him, both called by a note Isabel had sent through the baker's wife at dawn. Rudd's composure cracked. What is this? Judge Halpern was a narrow old man with tired eyes and no patience for theater. A hearing in mud, apparently. Mrs. Carver requested emergency review of debt transfer and child placement. Pike arrived behind them, sweating despite the chill. Isabel laid her ledger on the porch rail. Her hands shook, but her voice did not. She showed the judge the date of the labor sale, the dollar fee, Pike's altered wording, Rudd's purchase of the note, the sudden demand after the Finch children arrived, and the names of those who had heard Rudd speak of collateral before any official notice was filed. Thomas watched her as if seeing a sunrise he had somehow mistaken for a lamp. Rudd scoffed. A widow's scribbles. Judge Halpern looked over his spectacles. Widow's numbers appear cleaner than your filings. Pike tried to speak. The sheriff told him not to. Then Mrs. Voss rode up in a buggy, cheeks red from cold and indignation. Behind her came the baker's wife, Reverend Bell, and old Mr. Danner from the timber yard. Mrs. Voss climbed down, clutching a folded paper. I found this in Mr. Pike's coat last month when he left it at the store. I am ashamed I kept silent. She handed it to the judge. Pike made a sound like a kicked dog. Judge Halpern read. His face hardened. Rudd's scheme did not collapse with shouting. It collapsed in small, ugly facts. A planned seizure, a county fee twisted into bondage, a debt inflated by false charges, a note transferred before notice, a remark about a barren widow who would be easy to displace. Isabel stood through it all. When the judge finished, he looked at her. Miss S. Carver. The remaining Carver debt is void pending inquiry. Mr. Turner's timber land is suspended. The children will remain in this household under temporary guardianship until formal petition is reviewed. Given witness statements, I see no reason to remove them. Ruth burst through the door and ran into Isabel's skirts. Eli followed more slowly, face working hard not to cry. And he reached from his arms toward Thomas. Thomas took the baby and held her against his chest. His cane fell in the mud. He did not pick it up. Rudd looked at the scene with a hatred too cold to steam. This is not over, he said. Thomas looked at him then. For once, the giant did not make himself smaller. It is for today. Rudd's men turned the wagon around. Pike did not meet anyone's eyes. Mrs. Voss approached Isabel after the yard emptied. Her hands worried each other. I spoke cruel of you, yes. I was wrong, yes. Mrs. Voss gave a short nod, accepting the full weight of both answers. Your eggs were always good. Isabel almost smiled. So were your needles. It was not forgiveness, not entirely. But it was a gate unlatched. Spring came like a held breath released. The ridge held because the north timber still stood. The creek ran clear, mud dried. The garden doubled now, took seed under Isabel's direction, and 3 children's uneven help. Eli learned to mend fence and read notices. Ruth named every hen after a woman in town who had annoyed her, which Isabel corrected only when the names grew too accurate. Annie followed Thomas everywhere on sturdy legs, calling him Tom, because the rest of his name was too large for her mouth. The legal guardianship became adoption by summer. The judge asked questions in the front room while Annie tried to feed him a biscuit from the floor. Eli answered solemnly that he wished to stay because Mr. Turner did not hit, Mrs. Carver did not lie, and the horses knew him. Ruth said she wanted to stay because the curtains were blue and the dead could see them from heaven. Isabel had to turn away at that. When the papers were signed, Thomas walked outside and stood by the corral. Isabel found him there at sunset. You all right? She asked. He leaned both arms on the fence rail. Samson grazed beyond it. They carry my name now, us. If that frightens you, it should. It does good. He looked at her. Does it frighten you? She watched Eli showing Ruth how to toss feed without frightening the hens. Annie sat in the dirt, delighted with a spoon. "Ah, yes," Isabel said. "Every day," Thomas nodded. After a while, he reached into his pocket and drew out the blue marble. He placed it in her palm. "I kept thinking family was a room I had set," he said. "Turns out it was a gate." She closed her fingers around the marble. "Gates still need hinges. I can fix hinges. I know." The sun lowered behind the pines. Light touched his face, softening the scar near his brow from the barn fall. Isabel felt the old fear rise. That tenderness would ask more than she had left. That loving a house full of voices meant someday counting empty chairs again. Thomas seemed to understand without being told. "I ain't asking you to forget Henry," he said. She looked down. "I ain't asking you to be grateful either," he continued, "or to turn what happened in that yard into something pretty. It was wrong. I'd undo it if I could." She held the marble tighter. "What are you asking?" He took off his hat. His large hands looked suddenly uncertain. "To let me stand beside you where folks can see. Not over you, not in front unless danger comes." Beside, the garden smelled of damp earth and onion shoots. From the porch, Ruth called that Annie had put a pebble in her mouth. Eli shouted that he had it. A hen protested as though personally wrong. Isabel laughed before she could stop herself. Thomas's face changed at the sound. She looked at him. This giant cowboy who had paid $1 not to own her but to break a public cruelty, who had made room for her anger, her ledger, her grief, her blue cup, her sharp tongue, and 3 children born from another woman's dying plea. "Beside is acceptable," she said. He smiled then, slow and almost shy. They were married in September under the cottonwoods, with the creek talking over stones and every hen locked away because Ruth insisted they would interrupt the vows. Isabel wore a dress made from new blue calico, bought with egg money and butter money and no debt attached. Thomas wore a coat that fit poorly across the shoulders, because no coat in Mercy Bend truly fit him. Reverend Bell spoke simply. When he asked who gave Isabel, she answered for herself. "I do." The town heard it. Thomas's eyes filled, though he blinked the tears back before Eli could comment. Annie dropped flower petals in one heap instead of along the path. Ruth held the blue marble for luck. Mrs. Voss brought cake and stood beside the baker's wife without whispering. Sheriff Dale shook Thomas's hand and Isabel's too. At the table afterward, there was food enough that mattered. Beans with salt pork, cornbread, stewed apples, coffee in every cup, butter yellow as morning, children eating without guarding their plates, men speaking gently because a house full of women had taught them the cost of careless words. The blue teacup sat at Isabel's place, not empty now, but filled with coffee Thomas had poured. After sunset, when lanterns glowed and the children fell asleep in odd corners, Thomas found Isabel on the porch. "You tired, Mrs. Turner?" The name moved through her like weather over water. "Shh," she said, "and do not look pleased with yourself." "I'll try not to. You're failing." He sat beside her, the porch dipping under his weight. For a while they watched fireflies thread the dark near the garden. Inside, Eli snored on the rug. Ruth slept with cake crumbs on her sleeve. Annie had curled in the old blue chest among clean quilts, refusing all better arrangements. Isabel leaned back against the post. "I used to think my body was an empty field," she said. "Everyone told me so long enough I believed it." Thomas did not answer too quickly. At last he said, "Fields rest before growing." She turned her face toward him. "That is a dangerous thing to say to a woman who owns a garden." "I risk it." She slipped her hand into his. He held it as if it were both strong and breakable, which was exactly right. Years later, folks passing North Star Ranch would slow their wagons to look. Not because it was grand. It never became grand, The roof still needed patching after hard winters. The barn leaned a little, no matter how Thomas braced it. The yard filled with boots, buckets, dogs, kindling, wagon parts, and children's treasures left in places that made no sense. But it was alive. The fence stood straight along the road, repaired rail by rail until it held through storm and snow. Curtains moved in every window. Flowers climbed near the porch because Isabel learned roses could survive if spoken to sternly and watered deep. The garden spread year after year. Beans, corn, onions, squash, herbs, and sunflowers tall enough to make Annie believe giants grew from seed. Eli became the first in the family to read a contract faster than a banker could lie. Ruth broke horses with patience and named her favorite mare Mercy just to irritate the past. Annie grew up fearless of large men, loud weather, and dark rooms because the largest man she knew had carried her through fever nights, humming off-key hymns. And there were more children. Not all came the same way. A baby boy left at the church one frozen April night came first, red-faced and furious, with a note pinned to his blanket asking God to forgive a mother who had no milk. Isabel took him in until arrangements could be made, and Thomas built another cradle before supper, plain pine and steady hands. Arrangements were made at North Star. Then came two sisters whose father died in a logging camp and whose aunt could not feed them. Then a nephew of Clara Finch's. People arrived thin and suspicious and stayed because Eli taught him to fish. Then, to the wonder of Mercy Bend and the private astonishment of Isabel herself, a daughter was born to her one stormy November, small and loud, with Thomas's gray eyes and Isabel's stubborn chin. No one in that house ever used the word barren again. Not because childbirth proved it false. That would have been too small a truth for such a large mercy. It was false because Isabel Carver Turner had been full all along, full of skill, fire, memory, discipline, tenderness, and the kind of courage that does not shout when it can plant, men count, defend, and stay. The dollar Thomas paid was kept in a small frame above the mantel, not as a boast and not as a joke. Beneath it, Isabel wrote in her clean ledger hand, "The price of cruelty paid once. The worth of a woman never for sale." Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Thomas would stand beneath that frame with a child on each boot and another hanging from his arm, listening to Isabel call order from the kitchen. Hands washed, boots off. "Eli, put that book away before you pour gravy on the Constitution. Ruth, if that rooster comes in my house again, he answers to me. Annie, give your brother back his spoon. Thomas, stop smiling and bring the coffee." He always brought it. He brought coffee to the table that had once held one cracked blue cup and two strangers afraid of kindness. He poured for Isabel first. He kept her cup warm when she rose to settle a quarrel or kiss a bruised forehead or pull bread from the stove. He learned that love was not a speech. It was the hinge fixed before winter, the shawl dried by the fire, the ledger respected, the child lifted, the woman's name defended in public and whispered gently at night. On the 20th anniversary of the day Mercy Ben tried to sell her, Isabel stood on the porch at sunset with gray in her hair and flower on her sleeve. The valley below was gold. The barn doors were straight. The woodpile was high. Horses moved in the corral. Hens muttered beneath the lilacs. Children and grandchildren crowded the yard. Some mourned under that roof. Some carried to it by sorrow. All of them fed. Thomas came up beside her, still broad, still too tall for the doorway, moving slower now, but with the same careful strength. "House is noisy," he said. Isabel looked at the long table through the open door, at the bowls, the bread, the flowers in a jar, the blue teacup waiting by her plate. "Yes," she said. "Good." She slipped her hand into his, as she had that first evening by the corral when beside became enough. "Good," she answered. The sun went down behind the pines, and the windows of North Star Ranch filled with lamplight. Once, A town had looked at a grieving widow and seen an empty field. Years later, her family filled the ranch so full that laughter spilled through the doors, over the porch, across the repaired fence, and into the Oregon dusk like a promise finally believed.